Hello everyone, welcome to the Tech Flange with Flange Master Tal. My name's Graham, I'm the Flange Master of the Tals, and as always, I hope y'all are flanging it up and remember to bring a towel. Today I hope you remember to bring your technical towels. This is the Tech Flange, but we're not really taking anything apart or showing how to flange anything technical up. It's more breaking down the Xbox Velocity architecture and trying to understand it more, and also trying to understand how it compares to PC, PS5 a little bit, and really the focus more so is the Xbox Velocity architecture itself and understanding more what it actually means. And also, as the title implies, is it more hype than it is legitimate? Of course, we won't really 100% know for sure until we actually get our hands on it and actually are able to analyze performance for real. But we can, there's some marketing things I noticed where it seems like they're trying to hype it up a bit more than it might actually be, or maybe it's just marketing being marketing, where they kind of just do these things and don't realize people kind of notice sometimes. Anyways, so we should just flange on into it. We are going to start with watching the trailer while I kind of help intro this up. So with the Xbox Velocity architecture, there's four main parts, and all the Velocity architecture, it's more than Kraken, but it's similar. Kraken's more focusing on like compression and stuff. The Velocity architecture does go deeper than Kraken as far as I'm able to tell. So there's four main parts, like I was saying. The first is a custom NVMe SSD, and we'll talk about all four of these parts individually right away here, just breaking down what they are or showing what they are. The second part is hardware accelerated decompression. The third is a new direct storage API. And the fourth is sampler feedback streaming, which you're probably going to be like, what are these things? Well, we're going to explain them right away. So with the custom NVMe SSD, that's pretty much what it sounds like. If you're not familiar with PC parts, SSDs are solid state drives, so instead of having physical moving parts, it's all solid state, so there's nothing moving, so that it doesn't have to rely on like hard drives are almost like a form of record in a sense. Not necessarily the best way of putting it, but it should help get the point across. Just let me scroll down here where it says this in the thing so you can read it there for yourself. So with SSDs, it's instead of having all these moving parts that physically slow things down, because there's an arm that has to move on the platter. Here, we'll use this as a platter. There's an arm that has to move on the platter. My finger's the arm. So it's a spinning platter. I'll spin my finger to replicate the spinning platter. I know it's not the best. So we got the spinning platter. My finger is the arm, and it has to move like all around to catch data. So it's it's got to jump around. Well, it just goes back and forth while the disk spins, but you should get the idea. So with all that moving stuff and it physically has to go to a physical location, it slows things down. With an SSD, there's none of that. It's all dependent. It's like basically like SD card kind of stuff. That's not the most accurate way to put it, but for anyone that's not familiar, that's a good simplification, I would think. Anyway, so an NVMe SSD is a different format where instead of hooking through the SATA system, which is that's the kind of standard interface for hard drives and solid state drives, there's a new interface that uses PCIe, which is what your graphics card uses, which is way faster than what SATA can do. So by using an NVMe SSD that uses PCIe, lots of initialisms and stuff, it can get interesting if you're not used to them. So with NVMe SSDs, it hooks right into the PCIe system. It'll use, typically with a graphic card, there's 16 lanes. Sometimes you'll only get 8, but it's optimally 16, and you don't necessarily always use all 16 lanes, even with the very highest end graphic cards. So with a PCIe NVMe SSD, you'll typically use 4 lanes, and then the way the lanes are structured on a motherboard is it doesn't, depending on your motherboard, some cheaper ones, it's not so optimal, but optimally on a better end motherboard, it'll hook into 4 separate PCIe lanes that have nothing to do with the graphics card lanes, so it doesn't interfere with each other. So they're basically using that stuff now, and they're customizing it specific to the Xbox, and that not really big news to me personally, and I don't mean to be too negative or anything, but from my perspective, it's just well, of course they do everything custom for the consoles. So marketing wise, I'm like, well, yeah, I get why you guys would market it and hype it, but it's it's just of course they would. To me, it's just kind of like a duh. Of course it'd be custom. Everything's custom. It's a console. So the real main thing is it's got almost like half or so the raw throughput of the PlayStation 5 SSD. And really the premise of the Xbox Velocity architecture is the way all this architecture works is it doesn't matter really that it's that much slower raw performance numbers wise. The architecture and all those special things it does make up for it. And there's a lot of legitimacy to that. And where I kind of run into some issues where it says, more than 40 times throughput the Xbox One. Well, it's an SSD, an NVMe SSD from a hard drive. Like, of course it's going to be insanely faster. Just going to a regular SSD from a regular hard drive, it has huge speed increases. So the way they put that out there kind of comes across as misleading to me because it's like, duh, it's a hard drive, or it was a hard drive, now it's an NVMe SSD, which is even faster than a regular SSD. So of course it's going to be way faster. It has nothing to do with how custom it is or the Velocity architecture. Like the how much faster it is than the Xbox One X is just really almost mostly certainly just because it's an NVMe SSD, not because it's custom or the Velocity architecture. So the way they sold that, I have an issue with, but it's a legitimate stat. It's the way they framed it that bothers me, and it's kind of things like that where there's like legitimacy to what they're saying, but they're framing it in a way where I feel like you're maybe overhyping that a little bit, and people might be a bit disappointed when they get the real thing, or maybe not. Like I said, we can't really know for sure. And also, don't get me wrong, there's some very exciting stuff here, but it's not really the custom NVMe SSD. And more the interesting part about the custom NVMe SSD is how they got it flanged up in the insertable hard drive upgrade flange they got going. That's more interesting, and that means more, but that's more the interface. That's not actually the speed. So with the custom NVMe SSD, it's legit, but they kind of oversold it and kind of marketed it in a way to make it seem like it is more than it is. So we'll move on to hardware accelerated decompression, and that is very legitimate. But the way they sell this is like it's something new. It's not new. It already exists. What's really new and significant about this is their BC pack algorithm. So with texture compression and decompression, it's kind of like if you have a PC and you're like, oh, compress this hard drive, or if you're using WinRAR or WinZip or 7-zip or something to compress files, it's not exactly the same, but it's the same idea, where there's algorithms that do things with the data so it takes up less space, and then it has to do some work to like unpack it so it can actually be read, because it's kind of similar to encryption in a sense, but not really. Just in the sense that it does things with the data in a way that it's not readable unless it's undone, with the same algorithm just working in reverse. So as they're saying, the standard decompressor, it's good, it's fine, but they got something better figured out. And the BC pack algorithm is really what they should be focusing more on, I think, than this feeling I get where they're kind of trying to sell it like it's more new than it is. And that's the thing. So with the decompression and the way that can work, they can make up for that raw performance loss. So when they say, assuming a 2.1 compression ratio, Xbox Series X delivers an effective 4.8 gigabits in I/O performance, that's I'm not going to argue with those numbers. That's as far as I can tell, very legitimate, and it's actually really cool and very exciting. And I'm having a bit of a derp if that's specifically coming to PC. I'm not sure. I would imagine it is because they're bringing some of these other aspects to PC. But here again, this is where I run into an exception where it says over here approximately 100 times the I/O performance in current generation consoles. Well, again, because we're moving this stuff, like, yeah, that's amazing, but it's kind of a little bit misleading because a huge factor in that is simply the fact it is moving from a mechanical hard drive to an SSD, and all the physical moving parts are out of the way, so it just becomes inherently faster. And also using PCIe instead of SATA as an interface. So it gets a little bit mixed when they start throwing these numbers out there. I'm like, well, yeah, that's true, but the way you framed it's a little bit misleading. And to be a bit more clear, I think they should have compared it to current PC SSDs and stop comparing it to old hardware. Or, sorry, the existing generation of consoles is what I meant to say. And I think it's a bit misleading because they're not really being like, hey, just because we're switching to an SSD, we're getting this performance, but now we're doing these things, so we're getting even more performance over just switching to an SSD. If they'd framed it like that, I think it would be more impressive, more hype, and also wouldn't be kind of misleading, at least in my opinion. And that's the real issue I'm taking here, is like, all this sounds great, but to me, it takes away from it when it's like this stat where it's like, it makes me think of that old Mark Twain quote, there's lies, damned lies, and then statistics. And that's the thing. With these stats, you can frame them and manipulate them in ways to make them seem like it's more than it is. So I think what they should have done is compared just a regular PC SSD to their existing hard drives and be like, okay, now our stuff goes even further than a PC SSD. And that they're not doing that makes me wonder and makes me question. Because maybe they're not doing that because they know if they start comparing to regular PC SSDs, it'll be like, oh, it's actually pretty much on par. Because if you get to a Generation 4 PCIe NVMe SSD, it's just as faster than what the PlayStation 5's raw output is. Actually, I think the PlayStation 5 is a little bit faster than current PCIe 4.0 NVMe SSDs. Having a little bit of a brain fart. I should have wrote that in my notes. My apologies. But that's yeah. Oh, I got a note. Oh no, never mind. That note doesn't matter right now. That comes up later. Anyway, so we'll move on to the new direct storage API. So and don't get me wrong, I don't want to come off as negative here, because this is great. This is awesome. This is really cool, and it's long overdue. And that's like, this is awesome. So basically what it is, I should say what it is first, I guess, or absolutely I should. Anyways, so with the direct storage API, so basically because it's Xbox and it's Microsoft, and Microsoft has Windows and DirectX, basically the Xbox uses DirectX, because why would they make all this new stuff when they already have DirectX? It just doesn't make sense. It also helps them have more backwards compatibility. And just as a side note, I think PlayStation might be actually having technical struggles with backwards compatibility because they don't have this kind of consistent framework that's based on Windows and DirectX in various ways. Maybe not so much Windows, but more so DirectX and that kind of stuff. So because of how Microsoft approached the Xbox and because of their Windows and all that, I think that enables greater backwards compatibility with the Xbox, all the Xboxes, and the PlayStation struggles because they've just done different things and not had that same consistency. Anyways, that's a tangent. We're here to talk about the Velocity architecture. So with the direct storage API, basically what that is they haven't really updated direct storage to really have anything that awesomely specific for SSDs. And that's kind of where my issue shows up, is like, I'm like, well, you guys could have done this sooner for PCs, maybe? Just because SSDs are kind of becoming really standard for PCs. You guys maybe could have done this a year or two ago, perhaps? And it makes me wonder, are they holding this back for the Xbox Series X? And this is coming to PCs and DirectX and Windows. So it is coming, and it's going to be a part of DirectX and Windows, and it leaves me wondering, are they holding back on this when they maybe could have released this a lot sooner because they want it to be part of the Xbox Velocity architecture and so they can hype it up? And as a predominantly PC person, that does kind of rub me the wrong way. But don't get me wrong, this is still awesome. It's happening. It's flanging. It's finally here, even though they maybe could have done this sooner. And it's awesome. I can't wait for this to show up in Windows and DirectX for PCs. And it really should give a significant advantage for the Series X in terms of performance and all that. So, yeah, the direct storage API, actually really exciting, really legit. Though my only issue or criticism is you guys could have done that sooner, maybe, instead of holding it back. But I get that too. I get why they'd hold it back so they could market it. And with that, we're going to move on to sampler feedback streaming, which this is where we really get into it. This is the real meat of the Xbox Velocity architecture, but we do have to take a bit of a sidetrack here. So sampler feedback streaming is really awesome and really great, but I've not been able to confirm. So anyways, just a bit of sidetrack. This is an interesting little article from AMD talking about some of their work with the Xbox Series X and all that. It's a great short read. but it doesn't have any really like awesomely detailed info or anything like that. I just found it to be a really good addition to the Xbox informations. But this is really what I want to talk about. So this was 2016, about, well, July 25th, almost exactly 4 years actually. So with the SSG, it stands for solid state graphics, and basically it was a way for graphics cards to be able to use NVMe SSDs to basically act as like a page file or virtual memory for a video card, so that the data could just be moved around faster, get to virtual RAM, or even just be used directly. Basically use the SSD directly as virtual RAM, and basically have the SSD have a basically what would be a form of a page file for your video card. If you don't know what a page file is, it's kind of like you've got your physical memory, then Windows has what it calls virtual memory, where it'll kind of put aside a chunk of data on your hard drive or your SSD. So instead of going to RAM, it'll put all this stuff on your page file. And the catch there is, until NVMe SSDs, it was hard to compete with RAM, and they're still not quite as fast as RAM, although they're getting there. The page file is kind of controversial. If you can get rid of your page file in Windows without having a bunch of running low memory errors and stuff, you can maybe get some performance increases, but the way programs are programmed, a lot of them are reliant on a page file, so if you don't have one, they give you errors and don't want to work properly. So anyways, the point of what I'm rambling on about is I haven't been able to confirm if specifically SSG is being used, but it does appear that some form of it, or the sampler feedback streaming, is at least partly based on SSG technology, and I haven't been able to 100% confirm this. So it is somewhat speculative, but I'm quite confident that sampler feedback streaming is based, at least to some extent, on SSG, especially when they're talking about skipping the CPU to increase performance. And, when they say 100 gig on demand from SSD, what they're talking about is, so when you load data from RAM from your SSD, your CPU has to process it, has to go through the PCI lanes, and that introduces some latency and potentially some performance loss if you have a lower end CPU or it's running hot or whatever. And basically what SSG and sampler feedback streaming both do is they skip the CPU, and they're just going right to the GPU with or the virtual RAM or your actual RAM. So they're skipping the CPU and just bringing it right to RAM, which has a huge performance increase. And that's part of what SSG does, is, at least as far as I can tell. So it seems logical to presume that sampler feedback streaming and that kind of stuff has at least something to do with SSG. And I found this very interesting. I wish I could confirm for sure if it's using some form of SSG or whatever. So I can't 100% confirm it, but while we're on the sidetrack, so I'm not a big fan of this source, but this article was worthwhile. So even just for the headline, so when they're saying the SSD can be used as virtual RAM, that's basically what SSG does, in more or less, is it uses your NVMe, your SSD, like virtual RAM or like RAM, at least as far as I understand. There's not much really in-depth detail. So yeah, that's the thing, is they're even saying it here. So this is kind of the closest I've been able to come to a confirmation, but I haven't been able to find a for sure, yes, SSG is being used, but I'm pretty sure it is. And it does matter because SSG is huge. And I wish, if they are using SSG, I really wish they would be really upfront and clear about that. This is another great article talking about the Xbox Velocity architecture. Really good. Highly recommend you at least giving it a quick browse through. And it talks about a lot of the things, and it also touches more on some of it coming over to PC kind of issues and questions as touching on. So we'll go back here to the sampler feedback streaming here. And so back to that. So part of what that is, at least as far as I understand it, is with the sampler feedback streaming, they're basically, the big part about that is they're loading the data as needed. So with RAM and virtual memory, part of the problem is they just load like pretty much everything they might think they possibly might need just in case, because they haven't really been able to do this to this extent before. So they kind of had to, because they couldn't really call up things that weren't in RAM on demand without having a load time or a performance dip, or it was a problem, and it's a problem that they're solving. And this is like actually really cool and really interesting, and definitely going to give the Xbox Series X an edge. And yeah, so basically it's saving performance by just loading what you need, and at least somewhat on demand. I'm not sure how much so, but to make it on demand without that lag and latency, they're going to need to use something like SSG to bypass the CPU. And it's not really explicitly stated so much, but it seems implied where to make this really work that well, they start having the CPU doing all this processing, and they're not using something like SSG to skip the CPU, it probably wouldn't work that well. And I think they might need something like SSG to really make this work properly. And, you know, the stats, I have no argument with the stats, like the 2.5 times effective I/O throughput. I mean, we're going to have to see when it actually shows up, and, you know, Digital Foundry and people like that will be all over that kind of stuff. And it's, yeah. So, oh, another part I forgot. So it's not just loading like the specific files it needs, it'll only load parts of the texture it needs. And it's mostly about textures here. So it'll only load the part of the texture it needs. And that's really significant. So if only, like, if you're never going to see a full object and it's going to be occluded and you only need a part of the texture, you'll only get that part of the texture, which is a huge performance savings and huge savings in memory allocation. And this is super huge. And, you know, when they're trying to market this and hype this up, and they're talking about, all this stuff like the 100 gig on demand from the SSD, it's just, I'm left kind of wondering why they aren't mentioning stuff like the SSG tech. It's like, and you know, this kind of stuff's really more often written more by marketing type people who maybe aren't so technically minded. So maybe they just kind of made a mistake in not highlighting the aspect of the SSG tech. So here they say, providing direct, instant, low-level access to more than 100 gig of game data stored on the SSD just in time for when the game requires it. That heavily implies SSG is at use. Because that's the reason we have load times at all, is because the CPU has to put all this stuff into RAM, and if it's on demand from the SSD, now the CPU's cut out and they're basically doing like SSG kind of tech stuff. So it's just, there's a big question here. Just is SSG, how much is SSG being used? Is it being used? I'm sure it is, but it's more, to me, more how much it's being used. But also, why are they not hyping that up more? Why is that not part of the marketing? I'm just kind of curious why. So yeah, this is the most legitimate part of the Xbox Velocity architecture, is the sampler feedback streaming. That's really, as far as I can tell, what's really going to enable a real edge for the Xbox Series X. The three previous things, well, not so much the custom NVMe SSD, but the other two, the hardware decompression and direct storage API, those are going to be significant and add a lot. Sampler feedback streaming is really where it's at. But when it comes to stuff that's coming over to PC, we're only getting sampler feedback, but without the streaming, which is a bit disappointing as a PC person, but at the same time, I get it. They want their consoles to have an edge over PCs if they can, so people are more likely to buy them. And I get that, even though it kind of frustrates me as a PC person, because I can't help but be like, we could have had this on PCs if they had just bothered to do it. But don't mind me. I totally respect consoles. I don't mean to be negative or poop on anything. Just as a PC person, I'm like, can we get included fully too, please? But whatever, I get it. And so when it comes to their overall question, how much of this is hype? How much of this is legit? It's very legit. It's just how they're marketing it just doesn't sit the best with me, just because there's some things I've noticed where it's like, you guys could have not only been a little bit more transparent, I guess, about some of these stats. If they had sold the stats to show, oh, we're better than even PC SSDs, I think it would have been even more impressive and hyped it even more. But a lot of people are getting hyped about this anyways. I'm getting hyped about it. I'm very curious how this is going to compete with PCs. It's going to change the dynamic and the meta of console versus PC. There's no doubt about that. This new generation of consoles will undoubtedly change the balance and dynamic of console versus PC discussions, performance, etc. It's a very interesting time for gaming right now. Very interesting. And it's very exciting too. I'm super hyped for the Xbox Series X big presentation coming up on the 21st. We're going to be live streaming that on YouTube, so keep an eye out for that. And yeah, this is, I hope I didn't come across as too negative or anything talking about this, but I am excited and hyped about this. It's just I can't help but point out some of the like kind of whack marketing things where it's like, you guys maybe could have framed that in a way that was more accurate and would have been better marketing. And let me know what you think. Do you think I'm off base here? Do you think it's hype? Do you think it's legit? How excited are you? Are you also disappointed some of this isn't coming to PC or hasn't come to PC sooner? And yeah, I'm super excited to see the actual performance results myself. Very interested in that. And of course, like all these things, they can say all this stuff, but at the end of the day, it really matters how it actually performs once we get their hands on it. But this stuff is undeniably legitimate. And really the question to me is how good is it really once we actually get to using it? And there's also another quick factor here I'll touch on that I should have mentioned sooner, is that some of the stuff might take some time to mature to really get the full benefit out of it, because this is all stuff that the people making the games, the developers, have to program specifically for. So it might take some time for them to get kind of, used to this new stuff, get experienced at it, get really good at it, learn the ins and outs of it, have time for the technology itself to develop and mature. Maybe more of it will eventually come to PC, because that's one thing I guarantee. PC people, if this outdoes PCs, PC people will be demanding it to come to Windows. I know I'll be like, hey, Microsoft, bring this to PCs. Still buying your Xbox Series X, but please bring this to PCs. Can we have some equal footing that way? But anyways, if you want to criticize that last comment, go for it in the discussions. Feel free to criticize that last statement there. Anyways, we should wrap this up. This isn't too bad of a time length for a tech flange. I've gone on longer ranting about this stuff. Hopefully as good and concise. That's something I know I have to work on and improve on, is just being concise, getting to the point, answering the questions, not rambling and repeating myself like I've got a bad habit of, apparently. Anyways, we gotta wrap this up. I hope you all enjoyed the content. As always, make sure to subscribe if you haven't. Hit that bell for notifications so you can always keep up to date with the new content as it constantly improves and gets better. If you hit that bell for notifications, you'll be alerted when I go live for the Xbox Series X live stream commentary flange on the 23rd this week. And also, if you like this video, give me that thumbs up. Oh, where's my thumbs? Give me that thumbs up. If you didn't, give me that thumbs down here. I'll switch my scene. What am I doing? The hotkeys. Bear with me. Okay, there we go. Give me thumbs up if you like it, thumbs down if you don't. But if you give me that thumbs down, please hop in the comments and give me some constructive criticism and feedback. Please be respectful, and also please try and be specific. It's just hard to take action on criticism or feedback that's too general and unspecific. And yeah, as always, hope you all remember to bring your towel. Towels are always useful. Keep on flanging it up as always, and have a good one.